Hi everyone, I believe we're live now. I'm Greg Salmieri in New York. Joining me in a moment will be Ben Bayer in New Orleans. And before I say anything else, let me just point out that today, October 10th, 2017, is the 60th anniversary of the publication of Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. And what we're engaged in here and have been for several weeks now and will be through May is the Atlas Project, a program the Ayn Rand Institute's putting on to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the novel. It's an 8-month, week-by-week reading group that's taking place online, primarily on Facebook, but also elsewhere, and in person in a few locations, including New York, where I am now, and New Orleans. And Ben Bayer and I are leading it, and we're just walking through the novel, discussing it chapter by chapter, posting questions up on Facebook that there's discussion of during the week, and then having an episode once a week where we go on Facebook Live to discuss it with you guys. We hope there'll be a lot of feedback in the comments, a lot of questions and comments asked there, as well as with the live group I have with me in New York. This is the 6th episode of the project, and it's on Chapter 1-6, that is Part 1, Chapter 6 of Atlas Shrugged, the non-commercial, where an anniversary is also being celebrated. As it turns out, a somewhat less happy one, the anniversary of Hank Reardon and Lillian Reardon's wedding. So the way this is going to work is we're going to go through the chapter. What happens is we have the anniversary party in the chapter. At the party, we get a sense of the cultural elite who are Lillian's friends. Most of the principal characters we've met in the novel so far are there, and we get to see them interacting. Importantly, we get to see the first meeting of Francisco d'Anconia and Hank Reardon. And we also get a lot of background, particularly towards the end of the chapter, on Hank Reardon and Lillian Reardon's relationship, which has been a topic of mystery and intrigue that we've discussed on previous occasions. And at the very beginning of the chapter, we get some discussion of Hank Reardon's own motivation regarding his family, which was another thing that we were discussing in Chapter 2 and a little bit since. Ben's going to start us off with a discussion of that topic. So I'm going to throw it over to you, Ben.
Yes, hi Greg, hi everybody. And Greg, before I say anything else, I should mention that your sound is kind of low and other people online are noticing the same thing, your mic in particular, so you might want to deal with that.
Put my mic on. Thanks.
And Greg, I can't remember if you said anything already about first-time readers, but before we get into some content, it's worth mentioning that we are most interested in seeing what first-time readers of the book have to say. And so if you're a first-time reader and you're in the chat, please identify yourself if you want us to notice your question or your comment. Easiest way to do that is just to use the initials, all capitals, FTR for first-time reader. And someone mentions that my internet is working, and that is definitely a good thing if you were here for previous episodes.
Or am I still
it's a little bit low, but it's okay.
I've got a lot of room to bring it up, so, okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, over to you, Ben.
That's good. So as Greg mentioned, the major setting of this chapter, the non-commercial Chapter 6, is Reardon's wedding anniversary. And the chapter opens with Reardon pressing his hands against, and his forehead against a mirror, trying not to think. And at the end of this first section of discussion, I'm going to come back to that image and ask everyone, why is it that he's trying not to think? What does he think that he's going to be able to accomplish by trying not to think? So be thinking about that yourself as we go through this material, and I'll ask about it. You might even want to start by entering something in the chat if you have ideas about that. But before we get to that, I want to remind people that we had posted a question in our online discussion group on the Facebook group for the Atlas Project, asking a broader question about this section, about why it is, or rather how it is, that Reardon is trying to make sense that he seems to be paralyzed about going to his own anniversary party. How does he try to understand this? And why does he think he's paralyzed in this way? So if you have further thoughts on that question, also please keep posting them. But I want to review a little bit of what people who were able to come up with in the online discussion already about this in the past week. So Corey, for example, I think did a pretty good job identifying the dilemma that Reardon sees he is facing. And Corey points directly to the text on page 128 of the Standard Edition, where Reardon's described as having accepted the tenet that it was his duty to give his wife some form of existence unrelated to business, but he'd never found the capacity to do it or even to experience a sense of guilt. So simple dilemma here that he's sort of torn between, and this is what seems to cause his paralysis about whether to go to this or not, is on the one hand, he thinks he should, he thinks he owes this duty to his wife and to his family more generally to make an appearance and to give them some kind of social graces as family member. But on the other hand, he just doesn't feel motivated to do it. And Jesse later in the discussion points out a line later in the text where he wonders why this was a motive that had no power to impel him. So people did a pretty good job, I think, naming what the dilemma was that he's facing. The bigger question was, how does Reardon try to make sense of this dilemma? Why does he think he faces it? Why does he think he's torn between these apparently competing ideas? On the one hand, he should attend and should try to take care of his family. On the other hand, he doesn't feel like it. And what Jean pointed out in the discussion, I think, was important. Jean found the passage where he points out that he seems to just feel reluctance to do what he himself believes is right. And he tries to understand this by saying he must be morally corrupt, or rather, the only thing that he can think of that would explain why he himself wouldn't want to do something that he thought was right was that he was corrupt. And one question I wanted to pose to people now is, why would someone think that moral corruption is the only thing that would explain a dilemma like this? Why would Reardon in particular, why does Reardon in particular think the only thing that could explain believing something is right but not wanting to do it, the only thing that could explain that is his being morally corrupt? And I'll wait and see if anybody says anything about that online. But in the meantime, and I welcome certainly New York jumping in at this point if they have any thoughts on this. There are clues that Reardon himself gives as to why he thinks this is the explanation. And there's, I think, an especially important one that you see on page 131 of the text, which, even though a lot of people highlighted other aspects of this passage, they didn't highlight this one, and yet I think it's really important. It's the line where Reardon points out that throughout his life, whenever he became convinced that a course of action was right, the desire to follow it had come automatically. And you see him giving examples of this throughout the chapter when he's thinking about his work life, when he sees problems at work and he knows what the right thing to do is to fix them. He's immediately motivated to do it, and there's concretes given of this. But for some reason, the same thing doesn't happen here. And so he's perplexed because here he thinks it's right to help his family, to give them a good time at this party. But unlike in every other case, he doesn't feel the resulting motivation. And you can imagine why somebody would think that something like moral corruption would be the only thing that would account for something like this.
It's worth noting that it's unlike, it's not just the party that's like this and unlike every other case, but his obligations to his family generally, he sees as in the same realm as
right. And this connects to the party in particular, because all this time his family's been saying, you don't give us enough time. You don't give us enough time. Would you finally at least give us this one chance to show us that you care about us at this party? So this is kind of a stand-in. It's symbolic for his finally doing what he thinks he himself ought to do. But think about this. Why would somebody believe something is right and not feel like they want to do it? I mean, this is the trademark of a psychopath, for example. Psychopaths are people who know that it's wrong to commit crimes, and yet they feel no guilt, they feel no remorse. And Reardon surely knows about this. And you don't have to be a psychopath to have this problem too. I mean, there's this idea that there are such things as moral monsters, people who degrade themselves over time to the point where they are cold and uncaring and heartless. And Reardon's considering the possibility that that's what he is. So it's a problem that suggests itself by the fact that Reardon thinks, well, when you think something's right, you ought to feel the motivation to act on it.
We've got a few people who want to chime in on this in New
Sure.
York now, and I see the chat's getting some too.
New York.
Go ahead, Carrie.
Two things. One, Hank Reardon speaks a lot about integrity. So your beliefs, your feelings, your actions all should match, and he takes pride in that. And he thinks if he's going to be morally good, then the actions and the feelings should follow what his beliefs about the right are. And repeatedly, when his desires stray from the motivation to do what's right, he always, and this happens at least 4 or 5 times throughout this chapter, so there's a lot of textual evidence for this, he blames himself. He thinks his desires must be evil if he's not feeling the right way toward what he believes to be right. So I think it's not being morally corrupt. Being morally good means you're a person of integrity, and that he has the bad desires is direct evidence to him for that he must be having evil feelings. He doesn't blame other people, he always blames himself.
Ben?
Betsy Online points out the same thing that Carrie Ann just pointed out, that he has a tendency to blame himself rather than others. And what could be, considering that you might be a moral monster is definitely one way of taking responsibility and blaming yourself for a problem like this. Now,
We have a few other people who want to chime in here. I don't know if you want to take them or wait till later on that.
Sure.
Also, how's
Go
my
ahead.
volume now? Has it gotten better or worse or the same?
It sounds better to me. There were a few previous comments saying it was a little too low, but it sounds better to me.
Good. Well, now I've got it peaking, so I know it's high enough. All right, I'm going to switch to Al and Anna. Let's.
One of the other things we found out about Reardon earlier was that he has negative attitudes towards at least some of his emotions. And here, I think what we're seeing is he is not seeing that his emotions are giving him important information. That what he's accepted on an intellectual level is not entirely true. That he's accepted oughts, what I ought to do, that in fact he shouldn't.
So that's your diagnosis of what the mistake is. From his perspective, he's experiencing it as there's this conflict, but given that he normally doesn't have this conflict, he's not someone who normally feels this way, he ought to think maybe there's a reason in this case and I should listen to my emotion?
Well, in this case, what I think he's reacting to is the absence of the desire to do what his accepted values have told him he should do. Now, whether he's in fact suppressing certain emotions or simply not thinking about a certain area, I think that if he were more in touch with emotions and better understood what they meant, he would say, hey, maybe these duties that I've accepted in terms of how I should act with my family, maybe I made a mistake.
Anna?
Okay, so I don't think Reardon is a moral monster. So I'm not going to say that. So I think starting with Carrie Ann's point about integrity, I think that's important because Reardon has an enormous amount of integrity in his work. I think he also has a certain amount of integrity in his life in general, but he's disintegrated in a certain area. But he's also dealing with, in what's been shown, immoral people. So it's not as if he's moral in work and completely immoral as in his personal life. He's moral in work and he expected something to work out, but that's not working out in his marriage. I mean, he's described both himself and what he likes about living as austere. When you're working in the steel mills, you forge, you make things. turn out the way you want it to, but you can't do that with your emotions. You have to observe a little bit more, and he's not sure how to go about doing that to solve
You
the
cut back to Ben on this to see what he makes of that.
Yeah, Greg, I just wanted to say I take Al's point earlier quite seriously, that there's an issue here about Reardon getting certain kinds of information from his emotions. And I was actually going to make a point about that, because I think that this is the first time in the chapter where we see a important point being suggested, or raised at least, about the connection between thinking and feeling. And I think it's a neglected aspect of this chapter but it's neglected because it's subtle, that the connection between thought and feeling is a theme, or at least a sub-theme, that runs really throughout this chapter. And I'm going to have occasion in the future to point out a few other cases where this comes up, including with Reardon, and including with respect to this particular dilemma that he's facing. It's worth thinking about, why would he think that trying not to think would solve this problem? That's what he's trying not to do at the beginning of the chapter. Anybody want to take a stab at that?
Let's try for the online crowd on this.
Yeah. Why would trying not to think at this party help solve his dilemma? Remember, his dilemma is that he, on the one hand, thinks that he ought to help out his family. On the other hand, he doesn't want to. Why doesn't he want to? What is the best explanation he's able to give? What's the explanation that his family's always giving for why he doesn't seem to care too much about them? It's because, well, he cares about something else, right? And I think this has come up a little bit already. Yeah, and Judy online says his mind goes to what he could be doing instead. He's always thinking about work. He's always thinking, and we get at the beginning all kinds of cases where there's all kinds of problems that are cropping up even in the course of getting ready for this anniversary party. Problems with Reardon Steel, and problems with this equalization of opportunity bill that's about to be passed. So yeah, if only he wouldn't think about all these problems at work, he wouldn't care so much about it. And his theory is, well, then maybe he would care, or at least it looks like his theory is, maybe then he would care more about his family. Now we're going to have to see going forward if that's really a solution to this problem. And last issue I want to raise about this section, Greg, before we move on, is what do we think about his diagnosis here of the source of his problem? Is it true that moral corruption, or even psychopathy, is the only thing that could account for the fact that he's facing this dilemma, for the fact that he, on the one hand, thinks a certain course of action with regard to his family is right, but on the other hand, he doesn't feel like doing it? And, you know, we tend to think that we've got pretty good access to our thoughts and our feelings, but it's possible that maybe he's misdiagnosing, or he's not even getting the symptoms right. Is he correctly identifying what he's feeling? Is he correctly identifying what he's thinking? Betsy in the online group actually points out something about this. She says at one point that he's not really sure that going to the party is right. That's a possible diagnosis that's different from the moral corruption one, right? So if he doesn't really think it's right, then that would explain why he's not feeling what he thinks he should be feeling. Then again, maybe he's not identifying his feelings correctly. Then again, maybe his whole theory about how his feelings should always follow his thinking is mistaken. And I think to consider that, we have to move forward and see what else this chapter has to say about this connection. Does anybody else want to comment on this, or raise any questions, or suggest any other diagnoses?
Well, I just have a thought. Some of the things that get said about Reardon here in some of the comments, I think are a little oddly unsympathetic unsympathetic to his plight, particularly if you've read the novel before and you have ideas about what mistakes he's making, or if you just really dislike Reardon's family because they rub you the wrong way from reading it. It's possible to think, why is this loser got to spend any time with them? Why doesn't he just, tell them to hell with your party? It's easy to be not see why Reardon would want to be hard on himself here. But I mean, if you take it from Reardon's perspective, as I think Carrie Ann, when she was talking about his integrity, was doing, and also Anna, when you talk about how he has integrity at work as well as at home, right? It's this is somebody who wants to do well. Doing the right thing is important to him, and he's convinced, as best he can figure it out, that he ought to help his family. Maybe he's right about that, maybe he's wrong. But he also knows that people do wrong. They don't always do what they think is right. And there's something that leads people to act wrongly sometimes. There must be some kind of weakness or temptation or something in people that sometimes they don't do the right thing. And now he sees himself wanting to make excuses like, well, I don't like this party, and I don't like what Lillian likes, and I don't want to do it. And then he thinks, yeah, but I mean, I've given her no time for the last several months. Really, she says I've given her no time for 8 years, and you know what? She's right. I don't want to be someone who doesn't take seriously my responsibilities like other people who do that I have contempt for. It's, I think, a really, if you're an honest and conscientious person, you don't want to let yourself off too easily when you suspect that you might be doing wrong. And I think that's a big part of what's going on with Reardon here.
Yeah, Greg, and that's part of the reason why I was saying, another diagnosis of his problem here, apart from moral corruption, I mean, could be that he's wrong in thinking that he isn't actually feeling any guilt. I mean, he's certainly behaving like someone who feels some kind of guilt. He's kind of feels he's behaving in a kind of downtrodden way, and he is stoically soldiering through this proceeding, even though he doesn't really want to, but something's motivating him to do that. So what is it if not a feeling of guilt? And maybe it is something else, but this is something that's not clear yet.
All right, well, at that, shall we move on to what he soldiers on to?
Yeah.
All right, so he goes to this party. A lot goes on at this party, and we had to break it up into sections and also break it up so that we're switching back and forth where the main topic is. So we're going to go a little out of order. The first thing we see is we meet all the variety of people at the party, and we get a kind of send-up of the cultural elites who are there and what things they're interested in. But I want to focus on two of the things that happen at the party in particular that have to do with Reardon's relationship with Lillian. And then we'll cut over to Ben, who will talk about the kind of general character of the elites who are at the party. And then, so that's our agenda for now. So Reardon's coming to this party for Lillian. He sees it as something he's doing for her. He walks down the stairs and sees her. He likes seeing her happy. It gives some sense to the party. And there's something about Lillian's appearance that strikes him. Did anyone notice what it was, Mohammed?
Well, she is wearing that bracelet he got her, made from his metal, but also a whole bunch of jewelry that kind of makes the bracelet he gave her feel out of place. It looks different, doesn't look like it should be with all those other things.
Yeah, so she normally dresses very tastefully with her jewelry. Now she's got, as it's put, an ostentatious display. And then the only thing on her wrist is this bracelet. So it seems like she's dressed intentionally so as to show up the bracelet or to make it look ugly. In any case, it does look out of place and ugly. And the jittering gleams, it makes it look like an ugly piece of dime store jewelry. Well, that's interesting. When his glance moved from her wrist to her face, I'm quoting now, he found her looking at him. Her eyes were narrowed, and he could not define their expression. It was a look that seemed both veiled and purposeful, the look of something hidden that flaunted its secrecy from protection, which suggests that she's done this on purpose, not like she just had a lapse in her taste and judgment. She's having an effect on him. And one thing that's going on, I think, in Reardon in general, and we see it, we saw it in chapter 2, and I think we see it again in this scene, is he's trying to understand Lillian. And he has a sense that she's doing things to spite him or somehow to hurt him, but he also thinks that can't be right. He dismisses it as crazy, or maybe as unfair of him to think that, or else he thinks, well, maybe she has a right to resent me, and this is how she's taking it out. But this is the first time we see it in this scene. And what reaction does he have to this? Not what does he do, but how does he feel? Yeah.
He, like always, is like a pattern that he does, which is he kind of senses something's wrong, and then when he realizes what he's sensing, he feels guilty and pulls that emotion back.
Yeah, what in this particular instance of seeing her dressed like this is the emotion he holds back? Robert's miming it.
Wanted to tear it off her wrist.
Yeah, he wants to tear the bracelet off her wrist, but instead, in obedience to her voice gaily pronouncing an introduction, he bowed to the dowager who stood beside her, his face expressionless. This is an example of him doing what Muhammad says. So this is a, you know, a striking moment. There's another important encounter between Reardon and Lillian at the party. Does anyone remember? There's a one with Daphne later, which we'll talk about. But even before that, there's another, I think, really striking one where he has a realization about her. Robert?
What was it?
Which one?
There's a few, actually. Being Francisco, she has an aversion to Francisco. I don't know if that's...
Oh, well, that's
the
a
one
good point,
you're
too.
looking at.
When Francisco comes in, he doesn't like Francisco, and it turns out Lillian doesn't either, and she's surprised. And there's a kind of interest there.
Very obvious. She does not like him, authentically.
Yeah.
But also, I thought of Bertram Scudder, the fact that she invited him, and he curses under his breath about her, and makes it very clear he's willing right now to kick him out of his house.
Yeah, so who is Bertram Scudder?
Wrote The Octopus, which was a bucket of slime emptied in public.
Yeah, so he's someone who wrote a particularly nasty smear piece on Reardon. And there's all these kinds of intellectual hoity-toity literati at this party who Reardon doesn't know. He knows the Lillian friends, but he doesn't know kind of what they stand for. And he's not paying attention to who they are or hasn't in the past. But this particular guy, Bertram Scudder, he was introduced to him and didn't pay attention to who he was. But at some point, he realizes this is the guy who wrote that article. And he asks Lillian about it, and she says things like, well, you got to be open-minded, you don't... and he's stunned that she would invite this person to his house. He did not speak, I'm quoting now, because his consciousness was held not by coherent statements, but by two pictures that seemed to glare at him insistently. He saw the article The Octopus by Bertram Scudder, and then I'm alighting out a description of what it's like, but it's smear words heaped out, as Robert said. And he saw the lines of Lillian's profile, the proud purity which he had thought in marrying her. But when he noticed her again, he realized that the vision of her profile was in his own mind. I think there's a kind of metaphorical meaning to that, but the literal meaning is she's now looking straight at him. And what does he see in her face? Her face that's looking at him while he's reeling at the thought that his wife, the woman who he had chosen, the proud purity that he had sought to marry her, would invite this kind of obscene, scummy yellow journalist who's slandering him to his house. What does he see in her eyes?
She's enjoying it.
Enjoyment. But in the next instant, he reminded himself that he was sane, and this was not possible. And so he moves away, and he feels a told touch of dread, right? He knows he should think about Lillian and find the answer to, quote, the riddle of her character. He knows this is a clue to something that's been bothering her about him. Quote, this was a revelation that he could not ignore. But he did not think of her, and he felt dread because he knew the answer ceased to matter to him long ago. And I think it's at this point it's at this point in the confusion, or at this point he feels a flood of weariness. And it's coming from this sense of not being able to understand Lillian. It's overwhelming him. and he feels alone and lost in a gray desert, needing help and knowing that no help would come. And at that point, in a scene that Pooja pointed out online was a really interesting piece of foreshadowing, Francisco enters the party. But before we get to that, there's more to talk about. There are two comments here. I think just in the interest of time, we should forego them and start talking about the cultural elites, and we'll come back to this issue at the end if there's time, unless anything anyone thinks is really pressing. All right, Al?
There was a real-life book called The Octopus.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was by one of the muckrakers.
Yep.
Really.
Frank Norris.
Frank Norris.
Yeah, that came up. Anti-railroad.
Yes, actually, I once considered teaching that in a course where I was teaching Atlas Shrugged for a counterpoint, but I decided against it just for length reasons. All right, well, Ben, back to you.
Yeah, so it's we want to talk now about the heart of the country's culture, which is apparently represented by the bevy of guests that Lillian has invited to this party. And I mean, there's a lot that they seem to have in common with Scudder, whom you've already talked about. When I read this book the first time, this was one of my least favorite chapters because there was so much focus on, or I thought there was so much focus on these characters and all the nasty things that they say. And the more that you read this, the more you see something interesting is happening with the things that they're saying. And it connects to the bigger picture of this chapter in, I think, a very interesting way, which we're going to get into. But the question that we had posed in the group discussion earlier was, what are some of the common themes in the remarks of the intellectual and cultural leaders at this party? We really were trying to find some common themes. It's easy to see, well, they're saying a lot of things that are disparaging of different values that somebody like Reardon or Daphne would hold dear. Anna, who's there in New York, actually made a really useful list of all of the different things that are attacked, and it is quite comprehensive. They attack man, standards, reason, knowledge, logic, free will, heroism in literature, the plot in literature, melody, property rights. At one point, the idea of everything is attacked by Pritchett or by Eubank or by Bertram Scudder, etc. So there really is a kind of a lot of stuff that's being thrown at readers here. But it's worth thinking about what these all have in common. I think there's different ways of understanding this. And one of the first things that Anna went on to point out was that, most of the people at the party, after having made their kind of philosophical points, go on to comment on this equalization of opportunity bill that is a current controversy. And it's the same bill that Reardon was reading the newspaper article about before he came to the party. And I don't think we've said much yet about what the content of this bill is supposed to be, but apparently it's going to forbid any person or corporation to own more than one business concern. And this is apparently of some concern to Reardon. It's going to cut down on the hors d'oeuvre budget around the Reardon household, as one punk says, because Reardon owns a number of businesses, not just Reardon Steel, but Reardon Ore and Reardon Coal, among others. And so Brian, at one point in the online group, pointed out that there are a variety of ways in which the different philosophical views expressed serve as rationalizations for support for this equalization of opportunity bill, which is going to do something to take away Reardon's businesses. Greg P., not our Greg, but another Greg on the group, I think also makes an interesting observation. He says that all of these characters, I'm quoting from Greg here, espouse a self-serving philosophy. I can't compose music with a good melody, so let's redefine what is a good melody. I can't sell my books, so no one should sell many books. I can't explain an idea to you, so I will convince you that it is not understandable. And that last is referring to all of the different attacks on logic and reason and identity that are coming from Pritchett. And I think Greg P. has made a good point here. I think there's definitely a sense in which these remarks are self-serving. That is, they're motivated by a certain goal that these characters have. But what we now need to think about is the idea here that these characters, Pritchett, Scudder, Eubank, they all just have a kind of basic instinct, a primitive desire to pass the equalization of opportunity bill, and so they'll just muster any kind of rationalization that they can come up with to justify that? Or you go a little deeper, do they all have this kind of basic desire to find the appearance of success in their fields, and so they want to knock out their competitors in one way or another, and so they'll just muster any idea that they can get to rationalize or justify that basic desire? Or is there some core belief that they actually sincerely have and share that explains why they want to have this bill and why they want to knock down people like Reardon and give the illusion of boosting themselves up in the process of doing that? And let me just point to a few pieces of data here. But again, if you have further thoughts on what do these different philosophical and cultural ideas have in common with each other, please share them with us in the chat. If you know something about Rand's philosophy, you probably know that the ideas being expressed here are not ones that she favors much. So that's something in common, but not everybody here knows that much about her philosophy. And what would you find that is in common if you didn't know that? So Pritchett, for example, starts out by saying, man, what is man? He's just a collection of chemicals with delusions of grandeur that imagines itself important. And later he says, there's no meaning to achieve in life, that we're of no importance in the grand scheme of the universe. Of all the things that you might think make us important and distinctive, including our reason, he thinks are just an illusion. Then look at Eubank, who says, we're not a heroic being with free will who can achieve happiness. And he's the one who says plot in literature is a primitive vulgarity. Well, what is plot in literature? It's the aspect of literary art that expresses the choices that people make with their free will. And Liddy says that melody is a primitive vulgarity. Melody is, of course, what we use in music to express the happiness that Eubank doesn't think that we can achieve, with the reason that Pritchett doesn't think that we have. And so just with that data on the table, is there a common theme running through those kind of three core ideas that you could glean or discern? And
we have a few
especially curious if
here.
people, yeah, good. So what does New York think? I don't.
Al?
Well, I think of it as nihilism. And one of the things that struck me when I originally read the book many years ago was that back then we thought you could be a nihilist and not be dangerous. You might be a hippie, you might just sit around with a begging bowl, you're not going to bother anyone. But these nihilists are resentful and spiteful, and they hate people who pursue values and achieve them.
So they're nihilists in that they're taking something that's the center of some domain, and they're saying that thing's BS. And they're taking something that people care about and value, and they're wanting to tear it down. And Pritchett is doing that about man in general, tearing him down. And you're saying sometimes you think nihilists might be, kind of losers, but not dangerous. But you think we're now more aware of the dangers of nihilists. Okay. Did you want to comment on this? Or?
First, but
Well, all right. So why don't we do you first and then Mohammed?
Sure. Okay, I wanted to build on what Al just mentioned. So all the things that people value, that meaning, achievement, heroism, standards, reason, all of these are things that rise above the material, the aspects of consciousness, which is being denied in one fell swoop by the philosophy professor, and then reaffirmed across the different arts. But what they all want to reduce people to is the material, which they think should be controlled by creating a law. There are a few places, beginning on page 131, where people preface their remarks. There should be a law limiting the sale to only, so there's a maximum that people should get no matter what they want, and a minimum that people should be guaranteed. So I think that there should be a law, reflects the desire to control the material so that there's not an equalization of opportunity, which is what the bill is called, but really an equalization of the outcome.
Okay, so two elements here. One is, we talked about the tearing down and the nihilism, but now you're saying what's particularly being torn down is the spiritual aspects of things and saying things are merely material. And then on top of that, we have wanting to control that material. Yeah. And Ben, do you want to come in here? Should we go to Mohammed first? I don't know.
I'll just put in one point, which is that it's true that somebody like Pritchett explicitly comes out against consciousness and says we're nothing but a collection of chemicals, but Eubank complains about how people are being too materialistic and are distracted. We've lost all our spiritual values. So I agree that there's a certain view of metaphysics, of materialism, that is one point that's being used to achieve a certain purpose in this conversation, but it's not the only point. And I think that's significant. I'm going to say a little bit more about what I think is significant about it later, but let me hear what Mohammed has to say.
That we mentioned so far, like living heroically, plot, and melody. Those are three things that take a lot of work to achieve and to do well. And those that do them well seem to, at least from experience that everyone's had, great enjoyment in them. And so what they seem to do is they seem to turn their nose up on, oh, this thing that you think you enjoy, it's nothing. But that, that was kind of answered with the nihilism thing. I was just trying to introduce it by showing that all these things have a common element, which is that they're things that people consider done well and that people have high regard for.
So there's a kind of denying or putting down of values and achievement. And that's part of what the nihilism is. People online are pointing out that there's a lot of Kant in all of this, or are claiming that. We'd have to go into what Kant thinks and what his views are to formulate an opinion on that, but that's a common theme in the chat. One other thing in the chat, Ben, that I thought was worth noting here is someone pointed out, and this is a point that, I think he deserves pausing over, that they're being incredibly rude to their host, right? Which is also... Yeah. You don't go to a person's house and insult everything he cares about unless you think that he's sort of beneath contempt and is caring about these things. And maybe that's, again, another part of this. Ben?
Yeah, I definitely think it is part of it. And, I mean, on the Kant issue, I mean, there's certain things in what speakers are saying that Kant agrees with, but other things that he doesn't. Kant's in favor of free will. He's not a materialist. So, I mean, as I mentioned before, I think there's many different philosophical views that are coming up here. In spite of the different philosophical views, I do think that there's one common theme, and the different views are being mustered to sound it. And I think it's close to what Mohammed was just saying, that it's a certain view of human nature. It is first and foremost that. It's a view about man, and that's part of why I think it's significant that the section from Pritchett starts off with that. What is man? He is not, I mean, he's got delusions of grandeur. He imagines himself important, but he's not. He's not a heroic being. He is not capable of achieving values in the universe. And I think everything else in this conversation is subordinate to that view of human nature, whether it's Pritchett's materialism, Eubank's spiritualism, Slagenhop's view that empty bellies are the only thing that matter. So there's a variety of different views being mustered here to support this one view they all have in common. And you might call it nihilism. Nihilism's a term that's not always well defined. Sometimes it just means belief in nothing. But this is a very focused kind of nihilism, focused on rejecting a certain picture of human nature, a certain picture of human nature with which somebody like Reardon might represent. I mean, he's and we'll talk about this later, but he's somebody who thinks that he can achieve values in the universe. And so it's not an accident that they are being rude to their host and also supporting a bill that would take down Reardon. I'll close this section by pointing out that at a certain point in this chapter, Francisco shows up, and it's very interesting to observe the interaction between him and many of these intellectuals. Greg, in our earlier discussion, you described it in an interesting way. You said he shows up and he punctures their pretenses. And I just wanted to share that phrase. It's a good one. When he says, well, your real complaint is that your novels don't sell like soap, Bellevue Bank. Or after being told that Pritchett is telling us that nothing is anything, he says Pritchett should no doubt know more about that than anyone else. As opposed to his teacher, Hugh Axman, who taught us that everything is something. And one question I'm going to ask later when we get to a different scene in the chapter is, so those are some kind of witty lines that Francisco has as repartee against these intellectuals. But there is something else that Francisco says in this chapter that is the more substantive and direct response to this view of human nature that I think the intellectuals have been sounding. And it's actually not actually something he says to them. It's not something that he says in conversation with them. It's something he says to someone else in the chapter. But before we say more about that, Greg, I think you want to talk about Daphne and Reardon.
Yeah, so let's shift focus here. Daphne arrives at this party. Why is she here? She doesn't normally go to parties. She wants to celebrate, and there's something else. She says the reason she says is that she wants to celebrate when she's talking to Reardon, but there's another reason that she's not quite admitting to herself.
With Reardon.
She wants to see Reardon. Mm-hmm. Now, Daphne's really dressed up. She's, Lillian, who's met her before, is surprised to see her in an evening gown. You don't think of Daphne Taggart's body when you see her in her business attire. She doesn't dress up often. This is the second time we, the reader, have seen her dressed up for a party. When was the first?
Her debut.
The ball.
Her debut ball, which went badly, right, and she was very disappointed in. What's missing from her first ball?
An equal.
The type,
Go ahead, an equal, you say? What did you say?
the types of men that she could actually like or
Yeah.
admire.
What men? There were no men. There were just boys, and she could crush any 10 of them. Right? So a formidable male presence is missing. She comes in. Lillian, there's a little kind of interesting quippy exchange with Lillian. And then she says, no, I just want to go and try to find Hank. And she wonders why she said that, to what comes out, and what had prevented her from admitting that she saw him from the moment she walked in, as he saw her. So she's there to see him. She's very aware of him. She's kind of more aware of it than she's comfortable fully naming to herself. And she approaches him, and what happens?
He's mean to her.
He's mean to her. That's my wife. He wants in the rest of you.
So he lies to her.
He what?
He lies, I just realized. He said that he invited Bertram Scudder, but we know he...
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
well,
that's
so
yeah,
that's
much
right.
later.
he lies. Cagney asks, why did you invite, or why did I'm shocked your wife invited Bertram Scudder, and he lies because he's taking responsibility for what happened. So he does that too. He lies to her. We'll see more of that later. But what else does he do? How does he deal with her?
A very formal, almost like restrained, expressionless way of like, how do you do? That type of.
Yeah, he didn't add Miss Taggart,
Yeah.
but it sounded like he did after his word. So he's cold, icily formal. She doesn't know how to deal with this because their interaction was so easy in his office, right? They're friends, they're comfortable talking to each other like they aren't anywhere else. And yet here he's super icy formal. He's aloof. He doesn't seem to understand her. She says a few things that are kind of revealing of her motives, not particularly that she's there to be with him in an obvious way, but like how she feels about the party, and he doesn't seem to understand them. So Another mutual friend of theirs comes over and is visibly shocked by how she looks, and she's disappointed that Reardon seemed not to have noticed. So what's going on with Reardon? Why is he doing this? Why is he behaving this way? Is it because he's just such a cold guy, or he's not into women?
He wasn't cold to her before.
What?
He wasn't cold to her before.
Yeah, he wasn't cold to her before. What?
I think he's repressing the desire he has for her. I mean, we as the reader get to see Reardon looking at her, which she never gets to notice. He doesn't let her see him seeing her. Did that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So he looks at her naked arm and shoulder, and
Toward the end,
he's
yeah.
toward the end, but he does see her, and he watches her.
Yeah, she never sees him looking at her, but we see it all the time. She's talking to him and she's making a point about the party, which she thinks he doesn't understand. She was looking at the room. She did not notice that he had not followed her glance. He was looking down at the shadows on her naked shoulder, the soft blue shadows made by the light that fell through the strands of her hair. And then when that encounter ends, she did not know that his eyes were following her as she walked away from him. So yeah, every time that he can be sure that she's not seeing him, he's looking at her. And one of the questions that we asked in the forum was, there's a reason he's fighting against admitting to himself that draws him to his wife's bedroom that night. His wife's bedroom that he fights going to, hardly ever goes to, once in a while has this great urge that he goes to satisfy by going there and lying with a woman who he has to forget as he holds her. We'll talk about their relationship later, but why does he go there that night? What's the reason that he has to not admit to himself? Yeah, he's thinking of Daphne.
Yeah.
I think that's what we're supposed to understand from this, and that's why he's so cold. It would be a treason, to his wife and to his vows that he made, and in any case, he doesn't want to admit. We'll learn more about how he thinks about her later, but he has very powerful feelings for her that he's trying to deal with. The other aspect of what goes on with two other aspects of what goes on with Daphne in this scene. Francisco notices her in her dress. Francisco, who has a long history with her, and Francisco, who knows about the ball incident and what it meant to her. And what Francisco says really sums up her experience, which is what?
Magnificent waste.
What a magnificent waste. And Ben pointed out that you have to be careful to spell it the right way. But yeah, what a magnificent waste. So there's something about this whole affair and about her perspective on it that Francisco, with his detached and mocking perspective on her, and we don't quite know what's going on with Francisco, but he sees what's going on here at some level. And one other aspect of the scene, of course, is that combining the last topic we spoke about, Lillian and the bracelet, Lillian is going around making snide remarks about how she'd exchange the bracelet for a regular diamond bracelet any time, but no one will offer it to her. And we all know what happens. Daphne takes the diamond bracelet off her wrist and says, if you're not a coward, you'll go through with it. Any thoughts on that exchange or its aftermath?
That I'm surprised Lillian wouldn't, at least she said, if you're not a coward. That should have at least incited from her like an angry, or like, who are you calling a coward? That's what I would expect from what I've seen people's discussions. But she obliges and she gives it to her. Which also, I don't know why she would do it if it makes her kind of look bad, in the sense that she's, at the end of the day, still giving up something that's a gift of her husband. So even if she does not like him, as we speculated, it's still an appearance thing that...
Well, I guess, putting down the gift that your husband got you to people who don't have total contempt for your husband in public makes you look bad to begin with. So she's not sensitive to the issue of whether she looks like a bitch for having this attitude towards the bracelet in the first place, and maybe she doesn't to any of these people. I don't know. Ellen?
I don't think that Lillian has the skill set to compete with Daphne on that level of saying, of the conversation. I just don't. I think it was a very, there was nothing Lillian could do to converse with Daphne on the level that Daphne is used to be doing. And Lillian was, it's like Reardon would have like kowtowed to Lillian in that situation, and like at one point he's like serving drinks on a tray like a butler, after that.
So the fact that Daphne stands up to her in the way she does is something Lillian doesn't know how to respond to. Two just observations from the online forum about this exchange, and then we have to move on for reasons of time. Meg, in the comments, not these comments, the comments over the course of the week, noted two things about it that I think is interesting about the aftermath of the exchange. One of them is the same point you just made, that after the exchange, Reardon is suddenly now playing the really devoted husband and carrying drinks on trays to people and so forth. Another thing that Reardon does is notice now Daphne's naked arm with his bracelet is the only thing on it. But the other thing is that Daphne, who has up to this point wanted to get out of this party and was uncomfortable, now changes her whole attitude towards it, and she wants to be seen with this bracelet on her. She feels calm and free for the first time. I think we're significantly behind time, so we should. All right, go ahead.
Given a previous conversation, this is an important point to underscore at the top of page 153. When Daphne says, "Hank, I had to do it," she saw the look on his face. The line is, "Yet she was suddenly certain that she knew what he felt. He wanted to slap her face." We've also previously seen an actual face slapping. That also, I just want to point it out.
All right, good point. Thanks. Ben, over to you.
Good. Yeah. So earlier we had posted a question into the discussion forum about what positive emotional response Reardon experiences this event. We know at the beginning he's paralyzed about going. There's a lot about going to it that he doesn't want to. In spite of that, is there anything that he gets from this? And as you start to read the chapter and the scene with the party, you might at first think it's going to be his wife. He says he likes to see his wife happy, but that is quickly negated by the whole thing with the bracelet. You might even want to say that Daphne makes him happy, but given the conversation that you've all just had, that's not entirely clear. He actually stops smiling as soon as she comes into the room, and there's a question about why that is, which we've just discussed. One of the first things where you start to see him genuinely enjoying himself is when he's standing by the window away from the party, and it took a while on the discussion for people to see this, but Marianne was the first one, I think, who noticed it, and she points out this passage, which I'm just going to read most of because it's, I think, pretty important for the whole chapter. He stood looking out. Far in the distance, the red glow of Reardon's steel moved the sky. He watched it for a moment's relief. He looked at the flowers, at the sparks of light on the crystal glasses, at the naked arms and shoulders of women. There was a cold side sweeping empty stretches of land. He saw the thin branches of a tree being twisted like arms waving in an appeal for help. The tree stood against the glow of the mills. Some part of it was joy, but it was solemn, like the act of bearing one's head, he did not know to whom. Some part of the emotion that he was experiencing was joy. I cut a little bit. So one thing that you should notice about this passage is that it should remind you about somebody else's feelings about parties. And that somebody else actually shows up at one point in conversation and reminds Reardon that it is like her view of parties. And that, of course, is Daphne. And Marianne pointed that out too, that there's something wonderful about the lights and the flowers and the glasses and the dresses that can add meaning to an occasion like this if you actually have something to celebrate. But the solemnity of this feeling that Reardon is experiencing, that's something that we haven't heard of before, and it wasn't part of Daphne's experience of her ball. And there is something distinctive about this ball for Reardon. And he himself is not quite sure what it means. We're told that he couldn't name his sudden emotion. He had no words to state its cause, its quality, its meaning. And we look forward to see if he ever gets these words to name the cause of it. So, but the party itself and the way the party in some way stands in contrast to what's outside and his mills. This is not the only thing about the chapter that gives Reardon enjoyment. There's something else that does, and it's rather surprising, both I think perhaps for the reader and for Francisco himself, and you can name it in one word. And I think it's actually the thing about the party, the thing about this chapter that is the most significant event of the chapter, certainly for Reardon, possibly for the reader. What's the one word that you can use to name what it is that Reardon finds a surprising amount of enjoyment about from this party? Anybody want to take a stab at it?
Iris, gratitude.
What was that?
Iris said gratitude.
Iris said. Well, whose gratitude?
Francisco's, everyone
And that, I
agrees.
think, is Francisco is the one word that I was looking for. And it's not just his gratitude, but there's a great deal else that we can talk about here. And what's surprising about
Everyone
this
on
is that,
mine
of course, we know that in
that's a
advance.
name and not a word.
I think
Will
a-
says names are words. In any case,
A name is a
Francisco.
kind of word. Yeah, and this is surprising because, of course, we know in advance that that Reardon despises Francisco, and this is part of the reason why he asks Lillian to keep him away. Seems to be the one thing that Reardon and Lillian have in common at one point, that they both don't like Francisco. They despise him. But again, in the online forum, Marianne noticed an interesting thing about what happens. I mean, Francisco's gotten through Lillian's defenses somehow and has maneuvered his way to surprise Reardon and talk with him anyway. And the very first thing that Francisco says to Reardon is that, I know your wife doesn't want me to meet you. She's trying to stop that from happening. Do you want me to leave? And Francisco is willing to name this, this fact that nobody else wants to talk about. It impresses Reardon. And Marianne quotes this passage: "The action of naming an issue instead of evading it was unlike the usual behavior of all the men he knew. It was a sudden, startling relief that Reardon remained silent for a moment, studying Francisco's face." And not only that, but Pooja online noticed that one of these kinds of structural aspects of the chapter, which we've been noticing before in previous chapters, where the change of scenes suggests something on, probably from the narrator's perspective that the characters aren't always aware of. Right after he's done dealing with his wife and the issue of having invited Scudder, we get this: the flood of weariness was starting to rise again. He felt as if he could almost see it in thickening waves. It was not within him, but an outside spreading to the room. For an instant, he felt as if he were alone, lost in a gray desert, needing help and knowing that no one would come. And of course, what happens immediately after he's thinking this? That Pooja notices Francisco enters the room. And of course, still, Reardon is not thinking well of Francisco. But once they have this conversation, he feels this relief. And then after having said, no, I'm not trying to gain your confidence, people shouldn't speak in such language, they should try to gain people's assurance through rational persuasion. Marianne also noticed Reardon's startled glance at him was like an involuntary thrust of a hand grasping for support in desperate need. The glance betrayed how much he wanted to find the sort of man he thought he was seeing. So we've previously had Reardon feeling like he's alone in a desert, needing help and knowing no one would come. Francisco shows up, they talk for a while, and suddenly Reardon starts to think, something about this person who I had despised seems to be the very thing that I needed from somebody. And then there's this very interesting exchange And this is one of my favorite parts of the chapter. And actually, this is one of the things that makes this one of my favorite chapters in the book, where Francisco proceeds to name the thoughts and feelings that Reardon himself was experiencing while he was staring out the window in that scene that we mentioned previously, as he's looking out and comparing what he sees outside to the party. You stood here and watched the storm with the greatest pride one can ever feel, because you are able to have summer flowers and half-naked women in your house on a night like this, in demonstration of your victory over the storm. And if it weren't for you, most of those who are here would be left helpless at the mercy of that wind in the middle of some such plain. And now Iris's point about how one of the things that Francisco's giving to Reardon is relevant here, because it's the gratitude that he's expressing is gratitude for having been saved from the storm. None of these other people are willing to give it, but he is. Now, here's a question to think about, and I'm really interested to hear what people in New York and on the chat have to say about this. How the heck is Francisco able to figure out what it is that Reardon is thinking and feeling? I mean, what is he, a mind reader? Is this some kind of magic? Is it totally implausible that he would be able to figure this out? How is it that Francisco is able to figure out that Reardon is feeling this kind of pride about having saved people from the storm? How is he able to figure this out? And this is, of course, as Corey in the group points out, in the chat points out, this is the name that Reardon was looking for. He wanted a name for this feeling.
Right. We have some hands in New York.
And,
should I go to them, or are we getting it
okay.
online?
Yes, please.
Mohammed, or who? Well, Robert, actually.
Well, he has that ability. Francisco has that ability himself.
Okay. I mean, and it's worth, I guess, in this connection, noting Francisco answered, but Reardon asks, how did you know that?
Right.
And he says, I felt it when I was young once.
Right. So he has that ability, and he knows how rare it is in someone else to recognize what that sort of pride, what it takes to achieve that sort of pride. And he knows that Reardon has accomplished that, by his productivity, and consequently he should feel pride. No matter what he doesn't know about Reardon's conflicts, at least he should feel pride in what he's done with Reardon metal and Reardon steel, and with that storm going on outside.
Yeah, good. You cut back to me. So Robert's point is several people in the chat who are saying basically the same thing. Paul says, because Francisco's thought this same thing before, and Corey says, and Francisco's been there. Ellen says he knows the source and seen it before, and he knows a lot about Reardon. Brian says he's felt the same thing, but when? That's a good question. Well, he says he felt it when he was young. So, I think what's interesting about... Go ahead.
Just when Francisco tells Reardon that he felt that when he was young, Reardon feels a moment's reluctant compassion, which is interesting.
Did you say a moment's compassion?
A moment's reluctant compassion is the line. That's what Reardon feels when Francisco tells him that he experienced that when he was young.
Well, I mean, the implication of the statement, I guess, is that Francisco doesn't feel it anymore, or at least that's the implication that Reardon's taking from it. But one thing I think is really important to notice here is that we can understand how Francisco would be able to identify Reardon's thoughts and feelings. And of course, Reardon's trying to figure out how could he know this most personal thought and feeling. We can figure out how he could figure it out by using Reardon's own theory about how emotions work, which is that when you believe something is right, the motivation to act in that way, the feeling, seems to follow. Whenever he became convinced the course of action was right, the desire to follow it had come automatically. There's, again, this issue of the connection between our thoughts and our feelings is coming up here. Reardon seems to think himself that he's able to beat this storm and that he's worthy of beating the storm. And as a result, he feels a kind of core self-esteem. And Francisco sees Reardon in this situation, knows he's been in this situation himself before, has thought this, and has felt this before. And of course, the big mystery is how could Francisco, being the kind of person that he is, or that Reardon thinks he is, still be able to empathize on this. But now, one of the last things I want to talk about here is earlier in the session I had asked, what is Francisco's most direct and substantive response to the intellectuals at the party? And it's not the witticisms that he gives them directly. It's, I think, something that he says to Reardon in this scene. And if you take a look right where they're about, where he's about to name the feeling that he thinks that that Reardon feels, you get him saying it in a single line. He says, it's a terrible night for any animal caught unprotected on that plain. This is when one should appreciate the meaning of being a man. So here we have Francisco, first of all, saying, no, look, there is something distinctive about human beings as opposed to animals. And there is meaning in it. And that meaning consists in being able to beat the storm. It consists in being able to achieve values using the intelligence that Reardon has. And nobody else at the party is recognizing this. That's why he wants to be the one to give this gratitude. And it's not just gratitude that he wants to give. He also says at one point he wants to be able to give Reardon the words that he needs when he needs them at some point. Now, we've seen his ability to do this already because he's the one who's named this feeling that Reardon was feeling. But there are more words that he seems to be promising to give, and he's not yet giving them, but it seems to have something to do with the fact that of this gratitude, that he is saying we ought to be grateful for you. You ought to pay attention to the nature of the people you are working for, and you ought to think more about why it is you agree with them, Reardon, when you say that what you're doing is evil, that they have some kind of weapon they hold against you. And we've seen this language of weapons used before, though it wasn't Francisco, it was Daphne talking to Dan Conway. And we could say more about that, but we are running low on time. So Greg, I don't know if you want to consider any more conversation or just move on to your final section.
One more aspect of the Francisco Reardon encounter that I'd like to say a word or two about, and then we'll move on to the last big topic for tonight. What can we tell just from this exchange about why Francisco is there? What's his purpose, right? He tells Reardon that he's there. He gives him several reasons, right? Reardon asks why, to make me lose money, and he says, well, yes, eventually. But it's not because he's trying to sell him something. He says it's because he wants to meet him and to become acquainted with him and to learn to understand Reardon for a reason of my own that need not concern you at present. And in this exchange where he names Reardon's thoughts for him, right? Francisco starts by saying this thing about it's a terrible night to be caught out on that plain unprotected. This is where you should really appreciate the meaning of being a man. Reardon says, funny, you've named what I was just thinking, only I didn't have the words for it. And at that point he says, well, shall I tell you the rest of the word? And that's where he gives the point that Ben kind of elaborated on earlier. And Reardon's immediate response to that, right, is he asks, how did you know that? But the how did you know that, the words communicate Reardon's most hidden, most personal emotion, which he would never tell anyone. And Reardon realizes that he's confessed that accidentally in the question, how did you know that? We'll see other times this happens between Francisco and Reardon. But what's Francisco's response? The faintest flicker in his eyes, as of a smile or a check mark. So I think you can get the sense just from this scene that Francisco says he's here to try to get to know Reardon for some purpose. He has some kind of hypothesis or theory about him or something, and he's scoping him out and checking something about him. And he thought, he'd get this reaction from Reardon when he said something like this, and he did. And I think that's just something to notice about this scene. All right, with that said, abruptly, let's move on to the last big topic for tonight, which is Reardon and Lillian and their backstory. We find out a little bit about why he married her, and we find out a bit about what their relationship is like. So what about that was striking or interesting to people there? Any thoughts on the Reardons' relationship heretofore? Carrie Ann?
Two motives, at the very least. One, Lillian showed interest in and even admiration, apparent admiration for his work. She actually went to his mills and she daintily walked through, and he thought he saw in her eyes a look of admiration or interest in his work that reflected his own, which I think that's really what won him over. The other thing had to do with him seeing her as pure, and somewhat contradictorily, because he struggled with his sexual desire prior to this. Her purity was something that he found that he wanted to conquer, and that she was somebody worth conquering and honoring with his sexual response.
Yeah, so we've seen two sexual relationships in this book prior to this point, right? Jim and Betty Pope, and Daphne and Francisco. And what do we now know about what's Reardon's sexual history prior to Lillian? Yeah, Muhammad?
Bad. Every once in a while it's something he would usually repress, but eventually it would take over in like these bursts where he would, it didn't make clear who he slept with, but just, it seemed to be like just women he just met.
It says who he thought he liked.
Oh, he thought he liked. Yeah, but like they're not, we don't know anything about them so far.
Mhm.
That's the point. So that happened every once in a while. Every moment afterwards, he felt like he wasn't being met with something. Like there was something missing, something wasn't being fulfilled. He thought he would get something, but he didn't really get out of it.
Yeah, it says he was looking for a conquest. He was looking for something, but it was only a casual pleasure for them. So Reardon's somebody who's single-tracked, right? He's not, dating. He's not trying to find a girl. He's not socializing. He's devoted to his work. He's not trying to maintain a social life separate from that. But he occasionally meets women, maybe at work, maybe in other circles, who he thinks he likes. Though he's not, actively trying to date or whatever. He's not, like he never sees anyone. So there are some women in his life. We don't know the details. And he feels this intense desire sometimes that he doesn't know where it comes from, this intense sexual desire. And on a few occasions, he's acted on it with women who he thought he liked and women who were, willing, it seems. And they they were willing in this manner of a casual indulgence, or they were Betty Pope-like with him. And he felt disappointed, maybe ashamed. This was something he didn't want. He didn't want to do this, right? He felt bad about himself and bad about this desire, that whenever he acts on it, it gets somehow frustrated. And he comes to damn and put down this desire. At the same time, he has this image of his wife. He doesn't have a wife, but he has the idea that to make a woman his wife would be this kind of dignifying thing, like crowning her or elevating her. And what Reardon wife, yeah, like Reardon Metal, Reardon Mills, Reardon Foundry, Reardon Wife, and we'll get that phrase used later in the novel in an important scene. So, in this context, and that's the kind of, he doesn't know how to put those things together. In that context, he meets Lillian, who kind of fits an image he didn't know he had. Lillian is, in some sense, challenging. She's at once pursuing him, but seems like she doesn't want to be pursuing him. So it's not a casual, she's not just, up for it, right? It's not a casual flirtation. It's someone who seems like they're struggling with him. So, like, there's a sense that he's overcoming something. She's not someone who's given to casual dalliances. She's austere, and there's some kind of regal character that she has or seems to have. This connects with his sexual desire. He has the thought that he wants to bring her down, which sounds a bit like the kind of adversarial romantic heat we see between Francisco and Daphne. You could imagine him thinking of one of them thinking of the other that way. And then she comes to his mills, and they have this scene where she seems like she's experiencing some profound thing, looking at his mills, and that's the night he asks her to marry him, which she does. And it takes him only a short amount of time to admit that their marriage is torture. So we know part of why their marriage is torture because we've seen their interactions, but only now are we learning about their sex life. And what's their sex life like?
Terrible.
Robert says
It's a
terrible.
horrible.
Horrible. Everyone, no one wants this sex life.
No.
But what specifically is it like? Is it that she denies him, or
No,
she's into weird stuff?
She
Or what?
thinks men are animals, and so that's her duty is to
She's very condescending.
let him.
She
yeah.
doesn't have
She
any
have to put her nail
desire.
file down.
And puts her book, reads her book when he's.
You know, she basically concludes it's her duty to, from time to time, be an inanimate object given to her husband's use, like, but
Yeah.
to lie back and think of humanity, I guess.
Yes. Ben?
Harry online says, it's like being with Betty Pope, but he's not James.
Okay, it's like being with Betty Pope, but he's not James. But I don't think that's exactly right, Harry, because Betty Pope doesn't express contempt for the sex act. I mean, she expresses contempt, I guess, for herself and Jim in a way. But for Betty Pope, it is a casual dalliance. Lillian treats it as kind of gross. It's the most undignified pastime I've heard of. But then again, I've never believed that. And then she goes into the kind of stuff the intellectuals at the party say, right? So, yeah, Al. In that respect, I think it's true that they're alike. Yeah, Al?
Yeah, could we go back for a moment to the Reardon's prior women in his
Okay.
life? Why his reaction was negative, and I'm comparing that to, say, let's say Reardon was always a very busy man, and he was thirsty, and there was no Pepsi available, so he had a Coke. That wouldn't have caused him conflict or regret, I don't think. But there was something in those relationships, if you can call them relationships, that it was not just, oh, I had to have a Pepsi instead of a Coke. There was something more.
In
What does
other
that tell
words,
us about him?
It's not that he was getting something good but less good. There was something about what he was getting that was opposite of what he wanted, or was betraying or undermining of what he wanted. And I think that's right, and I think we're getting some kind of variant of that with Lillian. So what Lillian's doing in their sex life is she's complying, right? But she's complying as an object, as someone who's condescendingly above the sex act and above his desire. And in the same way she's belittling him about everything else, she's in effect belittling his sex drive. And she's belittling humanity through him, in the same way she belittles business through him. And so concretely what happens is he comes into her bedroom, he finds her reading, she puts her bookmark in the place in the bed and puts it aside and turns herself over to his use for a little while. And then he's lying beside her afterwards, panting and having done his thing, and she daintily picks up the book and resumes reading and then makes some disparaging remark. So, and Reardon himself, having been unable to find any satisfaction for his sex drive prior to Lillian, that didn't leave him feeling empty or like this wasn't what he was looking for, and not being convinced, has come to believe that there's something wrong about sex. Like this is a desire that can't be fulfilled and can't be satisfied. And so he thinks there's something pure or good or admirable about Lillian in this. And I think it helps to try to reconjure a more 50s mindset when one reads this, where the idea that a good woman is purer and doesn't really enjoy sex is maybe more, maybe less plausible to more American readers today than it was to readers at the time. But I think in many other cultures, I think this would be, is still a very prevalent attitude about how women should be. So now he's driven to the room tonight. He tries not to do this, and then once in a while he has this strong desire that he can't, something sets him off, that he wants sex. Something really turns him on. And tonight, we know what it is. It's Daphne. And he goes there fighting against the understanding that that's what it is. And it's the same reason that makes it impossible for him to go through with it. And somebody online described it, I forget who, I have to see if I have it written down, really nicely, the contrast between what he wants and what he finds in the bed. Not even who is too much for him. And I think that's really right. Ben, any thoughts on this?
I have to jump in here because this is the kind of capstone to the kind of sub-theme that I think has been developing through this chapter. So Reardon has had this dilemma about his emotions. Is he this unfeeling moral monster who isn't motivated to do the things that he himself thinks are right? He faces this dilemma at the beginning of the party. Also, with regard to his sexual life with Lillian, he also seems to think that his emotions are out of his control. He thinks that he's got these animal sexual urges that just overpower him. But what we see happening at the very end of the chapter stands in counterpoint to that diagnosis, because what happens is he thinks about this history with Lillian. He realizes what is lying in this bed, and his desire for her evaporates. And right after the line about the reason which had driven him here tonight was the reason which made it impossible for him, we get, he stood still, feeling free of desire, feeling the bleak relief of an indifference to his body, to this room, even to his presence here. He had turned away from her not to see her lacquered chastity. What he thought he should feel was respect. What he felt was revulsion. So he has gone through in his mind what he knows about Lillian. He is thinking about her, and as a consequence of realizing what he thinks about her, his feelings about her change. And so, at least as far as
different take on that aspect of the scene, actually.
Okay.
I mean, I agree that what's going on is he thinks earlier in life that his sexual urge is unrelated to his mind. And I think from the reader's perspective, we can see that that's not the case, especially in this scene. But I don't think his desire for Lillian died in the first month of their marriage. So he's never once wanted Lillian since then. Sure. What he's wanted was to have sex, and he could, in effect, Lillian was a masturbatory object for him. She was a body that he held, but he had to forget who it belonged to while he held it. And so he didn't come to I don't think it's that he came to the room thinking of it as I want her, and then thinking about her makes him think differently. I think it's that he came to the room because he had this sex urge, and as soon as he saw Lillian, and I think the thinking about it might have contributed, but I think it's more a narrative device that he's thinking about it on his way up to the room. I think when he sees her, and the contrast to Daphne, when what he wants is specifically Daphne, I don't think he can exercise that desire on Lillian. The contrast, I think, is just too great. So I don't. But anyway,
I agree with that. But I think
broader
it's,
theme.
I think it's just another. I think it's a specific version of the theme that I'm pointing to, because yeah, it's true that he lost specific desire for Lillian. He couldn't see her as the wife that he had wanted as soon as they got married. Even still, he was able to indulge his desire with her. But now what we have is, what's new is the feeling of disgust. He can't separate her from this disgust in a way which maybe he could before. And that's got to do with something about his realization about Daphne. And so
perhaps
I just think this is an incredibly psychological chapter, that there's an undercurrent of it running throughout the entire chapter. It's often underappreciated and quite thematically unified in a number of ways because of that. It's not just a parade of characters saying nasty things and Francisco getting into arguments with them about politics and the like. This chapter is really a lot about Reardon. It's about his psychology and hinting at developments yet to come in it.
Yeah, if we're closing on that point, let's just say a bit, and we're at time now, a bit about the title. So I agree that a theme in the chapter, or anyway, there's a lot of concretes in the chapter that pertain to the relation between the emotions and one's mind. The chapter is called The Non-Commercial, and there's a contrast drawn between the spiritual and the commercial. And I don't think we really have time to explore it now since we're out of time, but one thing people might think more about and we could discuss on the Facebook group, maybe on the comment thread for this video, or Ben and I could put up a separate post if people want to discuss it on it, is how that issue relates to this issue of emotions that we've been talking about and that Ben's really been highlighting. There are also a bunch of other aspects in the chapter that people brought up on Facebook that we haven't gotten to, and so we'll put up a post for loose ends from this chapter where people can discuss it.
Or we could have a supplemental broadcast, Greg.
Or we could have a supplemental broadcast on it in a couple of days if there's a lot of interest in that. All right, well, I think that's us at time for today. So this has been episode 6. Maybe we'll have a supplemental broadcast in a few days. We'll definitely allow for some continued Facebook discussion of this. And we'll see everybody next week for Chapter 7. Thanks a lot.
Good night.